Industrial Defender integrates sort of a combination of data collection methods, right?
Yes.
To get the richest data set possible. Before we go too deep on each of the individual methods, like, can you talk about why that's our approach, why it's not a active versus passive kind of approach?
Sure. I think this is actually one of our biggest strengths is the variety of different techniques that we have available to us to collect this data. And I'm sure we'll get into the specifics, but the the ability to differentiate one device from another device and to use different techniques between devices is huge. A lot of organizations will have sensitive PLCs, for example, that nobody wants to look at cross-eyed for fear it'll fall over or something along that line, and that's fine. We can monitor the network, and again, we'll get into the details in a bit, but we don't need to talk with that particular device. Other devices are more robust, more stable, then let's have a conversation with the device, maybe even via the protocol that that device natively understands and speaks. And that is the difference in data elements that were properties that we're able to collect is huge, honestly.
Great. Okay, so there's a few different collection methods that we deploy. Let's talk through them and the scenarios. Where do you want to start with that, Greg?
Sure. Let's start with well, one of these is not automatic, right? So this technique does not happen on a regular basis, so you have to do this manually. But we do, there are still many companies out there that basically manually document the device information for their OT environment. They walk the plant, they log the data in a spreadsheet, they do it once a month, once a quarter, etc. It's not on a regular basis even. What we can do is import that data into our system. So now they don't have to manage 100 or 1,000 different spreadsheets. It's all in one place. They can query the data in our interface. They can run their reports in our interface, etc. But it's not great. It's not perfect. It's like I said, it's old data usually, and there can be human error in there, but it's certainly better than managing hundreds of spreadsheets. So that's the
Sure.
manual ingestion.
And then even if they do move in that part of the environment to more automated things, there's still good data in those sets that they don't want to get rid of, right? That they probably want to see
Absolutely. Yep.
in combination with other data or other.
It's a good call for your historical data, right? If we start monitoring tomorrow and it's automated from that point forward, great. But what about the last 3 months, 6 months, last year? We could import that historical data too.
Okay, great. So we can ingest manual data. Now, what are the more fancy things?
Fancy things, maybe we start with kind of the common denominator, which is passive monitoring. This is most organizations look at this as the easy button, right? So we can monitor the network traffic and tell you all the different devices that we see, show you the characteristics of these different devices, what protocols are they speaking. If firmware is crossing the network, we'll tell you what firmware version we see along those lines. We are, if you're specifically monitoring a single device, you can do that passively as well. So what devices are talking to this device? What's happening? And what information is crossing the network? As I said earlier, it's not rich data. There's not a large volume of configuration data, but it is certainly valuable, reasonable data. And that's just plugging our sensor into a span port or a tap on the network in order to watch the network fly by.
Gotcha. So sometimes a starting place, definitely some level of visibility, but you just mentioned not very rich data.
Right.
So how do we build onto it from there?
Yeah, so it's a common way for us to get started with an organization. So we can do this, use passive monitoring for asset discovery. We'll tell you all the devices we see, the protocols, as I said earlier, and then you can onboard those devices into a more active conversation. And we have several options for that. One would be what we call native polling, but this is leveraging your greatest hits of OT protocols, I guess you could say. DNP3, Modbus, ENIP, Delta V, Siemens, Step 7, etc. Basically 8 or 9 of the heavy hitters, most common OT protocols out there. If If the device understands that protocol, then we can have a conversation, and the device itself knows how to respond to the question we ask. Tell me about yourself in layman's terms, and it will tell us about itself. We know how to receive that data, we know how to log that data and store it and use it. And so that's the most safe, active conversation you can have with OT devices is via the OT protocols themselves.
And so there are other active channels as well?
There certainly are. So these are more IT protocols instead of OT protocols. We call this agentless. I think they're more IT protocols. So we could use, and we use these all the time for network devices, for example. So we can SSH to your firewalls and switches because these are valuable devices that you want to know and understand the configurations of. So SSH, Telnet, SNMP. We can receive syslog from devices as well and log that traffic based on the key value pairs that you want to look for, things along those lines. Like I said, IT-based protocols to do the same thing, basically. We can even do HTML screen scraping. So for the OT devices, if you have a PLC that really just has an HTML output screen and that's it, we can pull field values off of that HTML screen and log that data as well.
Nice. So you mentioned that was maybe a form of agentless, but we haven't really hit on agent specifically. Can we just talk about what that word means in
Sure.
this context and the scenarios for using or not using?
Yeah. So we've been using agent technology now for well over a decade and a half, I'd say now maybe. We have agents that run on Windows, Linux, Unix, even Solaris. Speaking of how old we've been running agents, there are some distinct advantages to using an agent versus agentless. So we could use SSH to connect to a Linux or a Unix machine to collect the configuration information. We could use WinRM to do the same thing, which includes PowerShell to collect data from a Windows machine. If you choose to do that versus an agent, the data is about 90% identical, right? But the agent collects a little bit more. There are distinct advantages of leveraging the agent versus the agentless techniques. Both work, both are fine. Agents, for example, we cap or throttle the CPU usage. We never use more than 1% of the CPU. We also give you control over the network bandwidth that's going to be used between the agent and our sensor. If we remotely ask the question via WinRM to the Windows machine, there's no control over what resources are going to be used. The Windows machine just uses whatever resources it wants to use to answer the query we're giving it, which is fine. It's just that you don't have that kind of control. Also, if a security event of some kind occurs, like somebody fails to authenticate, password, either a bad guy is trying to brute force their way in or somebody plugs in a USB stick. These are security events that we're also always monitoring for. So as soon as that happens with an agent, you'll get that information within the UI and alerts could be generated, etc., immediately.
And then we kind of have a unique method that skirts around this agent or agentless conversation, right?
That's right.
Industrial Defender Reach. Can you
Yes.
talk about that real quick?
Yeah, so reach is a ricochet of our agent. It basically gives you the same output that the agent gives you as opposed to WinRM, which only gives you about 90%. Reach is identical to the agent. It's just that there's no installation for your Windows machines. It's just a binary. You double click on it or execute it, and it spits out an output file that can be imported into our interface, into our solution, and it's as if an agent was run. The only difference is there's no service installed, there's nothing running in memory, it's just sitting on the desktop or server.
Nice. Were there any other data collection methods you wanted to cover?
We do have the ability, so if the client has database of some kind where they've been storing all of this information, we can build a set of queries to pull the data out of that and populate our solution. And then from that point forward, leverage the automated solutions that we have, which we've been talking about, the different techniques, to automatically collect that data on a daily basis.
So our collection of techniques, blending this, gets us the richest set of OT asset data possible. But I also want to emphasize kind of the point around minimum impact to operations or no impact to operations.
For sure.
I know we've also kind of characterize the insights we're able to provide as sort of an IT level of visibility. But I also don't want to scare folks into thinking that these are, echoing early days of IT scanning your OT environments and knocking systems offline, right? So
Sure.
let's talk a little bit about that topic.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah. Our goal is to give you that level of visibility that companies are used to on the IT side safely in an OT environment. So, I mean, some of these techniques that we've been talking about don't have, zero to minimum, let's just say zero risk, honestly. Manual ingestion, we're not even on the network for manual ingestion. We're just doing a little bit of work to import those files into our solution. That's the same idea. We're just watching the network. The network card that's plugged into the span port or the tap doesn't even have an IP address. It's just literally passively watching the network fly by. All the other ones, keep in mind that Industrial Defender has been around since 2006. So we've been doing this for 18 years now. This is something that is tried and true. We've never tripped a plant or anything like that. We know what we're doing. Honestly, the flexibility of being able to use these different techniques on different devices is where the power is, right? So, yes, if there is an ancient OT device that, again, nobody wants to look at cross-eyed, just passively watch the traffic. That's fine. We won't touch it. We won't talk to it. But there is meaningful, rich, real data that we can collect from other devices that, for instance, speak ENIPSIP, right? So if a device speaks that language, that protocol, then we can safely collect that data via the protocol that device was built to support, right? We don't do scans or sweeps of the network. We're not knocking on ports in order to find vulnerabilities or what's behind the port, what process is behind the port. That's not how we do any of our data collections.